Hello there, welcome to this video. I'm glad that you're deciding to check in. My name is Matt Petrowski, and in this video, we're going to be taking a look at FileMaker's related value lists. So stick with me and we'll be on my desktop in just a few. Alrighty, so what are we talking about today? Well, if you're just checking into this video for the first time, then follow along. I'm going to do this really quickly. We're going to see what file I'm actually using. I'm using a copy of FileMaker 16. You're probably going to want to choose this option right here of Get Started, and that's in FileMaker 16. If yours looks different, then you'll probably want to find the file that we're going to be looking at. I'm scrolling down here, and I'm getting to this area right here where it says Explore the Possibilities, and I choose this option of See Advanced Solutions. And again, this is in FileMaker 16. Now, if you've been following the series, then you probably already have the file and you've been making the changes. And you can go back a couple of videos if this is the video that you're just checking into, but the invoices solution is what we're working with in order to learn and understand things. So I'm going to refer you to the previous videos. To get that actually saved to your hard drive, I needed to click cancel there. I already have my copy in FileMaker. I'm going to show that. Now in the previous video, I'll explain what we've already done up to this point. This is basically one of FileMaker's most complex FileMaker solutions, but therein it's not that complex of a solution. Any FileMaker solution can get much more complex than this. And what we had started to do is, somebody had mentioned that this is the party model, and I have to be honest, I haven't actually looked in depth at the party model, and in the world of FileMaker, there's a gentleman named Dave Graham who talks about the party model, and that's basically how you structure your data, and that's what we're talking about starting in this subsection of the series. The whole series is called Scriptology Mastery Course, but I'm breaking it up into subsections, the environment first, then we have our fields and calculations, and now we're looking at data structure and how we actually put things together in FileMaker. So we have this table that formerly FileMaker in this database had called this customers. So when we looked at the tables, this table right here, which is currently named people, FileMaker had named that table customers. But in the world of developing databases, we really want to keep all of our items that are of the same type in the same table so that we can primarily avoid duplicates. So rather than having a customers table, vendors table, and employees table, we just put that all down into one table called people. So that was the first change that was made. Next, we actually needed to wire things up, and in the fields, what I did is, aside from renaming them, and I'll refer you to a previous video on that one, we changed FileMaker from actually using serial values. I'm going to double-click this field and bring it up. So formerly, FileMaker was using this option of serial numbers. We wanted this database to be more robust, so I changed that to a calculated value where we use FileMaker's getUUID function. And so that's what we've done so far in this database. Now we had to wire it up, and what we're going to be learning in this lesson is we're going to be learning about FileMaker's ability to use related value lists. Now, as a new FileMaker learner, as I open up this dialog so that we can zoom in on it, when you come into this dialog, if you've never worked with FileMaker before, the dialog can be a little confusing. In fact, if you've saved the file and you haven't been following along, again, go to previous videos, your graph will not look like this when you initially open FileMaker's invoices solution. It's actually arranged a little bit differently and a little bit weird. And what we're learning in these videos is how can we structure this FileMaker database so that it not only makes sense to us, but almost makes sense to anybody else who immediately came into this solution. Now in FileMaker, there's so many ways that you can approach a problem. Typically, you're going to have a number of collections of these items that are called table occurrences. And throughout the course of time, they've sort of become to be known as table occurrence groups. Now we're going to create another table occurrence group in this graph. And the way that you approach FileMaker's graph, many times new FileMaker learners come in and they think only in terms of what's their primary objective with regards to solving the problem that needs to be solved, a la creating their solution. And they really approach this graph from a singular perspective. This graph is basically like a blank canvas where you can put all kinds of interconnected groups in order to facilitate whatever you want to have happen in your FileMaker solution. So you can see over here what I've already done is I've taken the opportunity to add some developer tables. So go watch the previous video about developer tables if you haven't already watched that one. Here is my primary connection of all of my table occurrences, which is facilitating the main operation of my database. But here's the problem with FileMaker and this graph. It can become very confusing and very convoluted very quickly. That's a lot of varies. So it's best to take the approach to segment out this graph as much as possible. And we're going to do that with value lists. Now what we did is we originally, in the previous video that I recorded, we went to the File menu, we chose Manage, and we chose Value Lists. And when you're a new FileMaker learner, this is one of the most basic things that a new FileMaker developer will do. They will come in here and they will use FileMaker's value lists. And you can see right here, we already have a lot of them selected right here. They are all set to custom values. Now we did the same thing when we changed the table from customers to people, and we decided in the people table, we're just going to classify the data. That was the previous video to this one. Those classifications, we initially started out with a custom values value list. We can see that right here with customer, vendor, and employee. As I open this up, the one thing that we typically want to avoid when we're going to move from beginning to intermediate and then to advanced is we actually want to avoid this whole area. We don't really want to use custom values because FileMaker's own method of allowing custom values to actually be edited, or the control that you give. And if you have a question about that, I'm going to refer you to a previous video about, I believe, if it's not called field options, it's probably, I'll have to think about it, or if you've been following the series, put it down in the comments. But it basically talks about the, it may be value lists all the way back in the environments. It talks about the fact that when you provide a user with the edit option on a value list and you allow a user to come in here and edit these values, and FileMaker presents a different dialog, the user can actually come in here and get rid of them and delete them, which is not actually a good user interface if you as the developer say, I want to have these values, but I also want to allow a user to add new values. Well, there's two ways to approach that. You can use FileMaker's native features where it has two options. One of them is to go edit the value list, which allows a user to accidentally get rid of everything. Very bad. I've never used it. And then the other option is to simply just add one additional option into that particular value list selection. But that can become a bit tedious. So typically when a user wants to add a value, they want it to persist. So, knowing that, we don't want to use our custom values list anymore. We want to use a related value list. Now, in yesterday's video, what I started to show was how we can create this exact list of customer, vendor, employees, and having additional classifications. And we're going to do it with a custom value list. Now, typically, as I open up FileMaker's Manage Database window, what happens is a value list in most FileMaker solutions is established based on the context in which a user may be working. So say, for example, typically a FileMaker developer will come in, select a table occurrence, and choose, I want to get all of, this doesn't make sense, but actually line items might make a little bit more sense. I want to get all of the different types of possible products that a user can choose or sub-products according to this. Regardless of what I'm trying to convey here, the value list ends up being integrated into the logic or into the structure of our solution. So here's what I'm going to propose to you. Use the graph and separate things out, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So we created a dedicated table. As I switch to tables here, that dedicated table was this one, called values. Now this one single table is going to store or can store all of our different possible value lists for the whole solution. This in turn all comes down to a matter of classifying the data, just like we learned in the previous video. So what we're going to do is we're going to have multiple value lists within one single values table, and we're simply going to classify that data. So switching back to the graph, we already have a developer table that I've added right here, but we're going to add a values table, and then we're going to add a value list that we want to get out of that values table. So I'm going to rename this table occurrence just to simply values. This one I'm going to rename to values, and then what is the type of list that I'm going to actually be getting? Well, it's going to be, currently the value list is called person type. So as I put that in, we've got our two table occurrences. Now we're not ready to connect them yet, because what we need to do is we need to understand that in all of FileMaker, the only thing that this graph represents is your ability to extract the data you want and the way that you want to see it. So we need to add the values first. So let's go do that. And here's the reason why I use my developer tables. We can go to the Manage Layouts, which I'm doing with Command-Shift-L, and bring those up. In that list, I have a folder called Developer, and here is my values table. Now this is where I, as a developer, am able to modify and control data and work with things as I set things up. Now we already have the table right here, and I have added some fields. In fact, let's go into Define Database quickly and take a look at those. These are the fields. You can see quite simply, there's just 4 of them. We almost always in all tables want to add an ID field, even if it's not necessarily needed. In this case, I know that I don't necessarily need this ID in terms of the way that I'm going to be using this table, but I know that somewhere down the road, I inevitably do. In fact, we'll probably talk about default fields to add. But here's how it works. I'm going to have a value, which is something that the user can choose from. I am going to need to classify this value as part of a value list. So the category is what we're going to use for that. And then finally, as I mentioned in the previous video, you can use one of 2 options in terms of what is the value that's saved based on the user selection. And we'll see how that plays in. We can do an enumeration, or we can use the ID value. I'm going to use an enumeration because it'll be easier for us to understand, visualize, and see. So now let's add our values. So I'm going to add 3 records, and there's my ID value right there. And as I zoom in, what are those 3 values? Well, they're exactly what we see right here: customer, vendor, and employee. So the value that the user can choose from is customer, if I can spell, vendor, and employee. Employee. There we go. All right. Now, as I mentioned, one of the things that's really nice when we're going to store data is not that we store the actual literal value, because the literal value can always potentially change. But when we match up a literal value with a number, typically we don't change the numbers. Think about the rest of the world that we live in. In the US, we get a number assigned to us when we're born. It's a social security number. When you learn to drive, you get a number that is assigned to you, and sometimes it's mixed with digits. But you think about all these other systems where numbers are used in order to track things, it just makes sense. So this is where you choose in perpetuity, for now and forever, all customers are going to be designated as 1, all vendors as 2, and all employees as 3. And these are the values that you're actually going to use to search on. So now we get into our category. What is our category? Our category for this list might be simply person type. Now, all of these values are going to be part of that person type value list, so they all need to be in the same category. So as I copy and paste this, that's what I'm going to need to filter out of the graph in order to make the related value list. So all of our data is now structured properly in order to have this one value list within the rest of other value lists. Now let's add some more values just so that we really understand what we're doing here. I'm going to add 3 more records, and I'm going to add widget, Gidget, and whatchamacallit. Nice long one there. Now I'm going to classify this value list into a different group, and maybe that would be product type. Now they're very similar here, But it's key to distinguish that out of all of this data, I'm able to pull out exactly what I want because of that classification. I've said I want to see person type. And when I want to see person type, I only want to see these 3 values. That makes sense. It's right here on screen. You're watching it. So we need to now create a structure that allows us to filter this out within the relationship graph using those 2 table occurrences that we had created. So as I zoom out here and we go into the defined database, this is where we ask the question, how are we going to make it so that from a given perspective, we can actually pull out just what we want? And the reason that it's good to learn this lesson is because once you do, you see the graph in a different perspective. Instead of it being some abstract thing where you just wire up connections based on relationships of true data, you start to see the graph as something where you can get what you want when you want it. So what is it that I want? I want only those values that are coming from a category, and the category in particular is person type. So here's what we can do. We're going to go into our fields, into our values, and what we're going to do is create a special type of field. And this field is known as a constant. A constant is exactly what it sounds like. It is constantly the same thing. And that's pretty much all that is. Now, there's 2 ways that you can do this. I'm going to actually, because in the way that I name things in FileMaker, a constant is something that isn't going to change, which is pretty much the same thing as a global. So I'm going to name this in all caps, and I'm going to call it something like people type. You can see that right down there. And if you like to, you can put in the underscore so that it makes sense. Now, the one thing that I'm going to choose is I'm going to choose to make this a calculation. Now, when I create this and the calculation comes up, I'm going to have a couple of different options. And when I say a constant value, you pretty much know that it's always going to be the same thing. And what are we looking for the value list? We're looking for person type, I think, unless I called it people type. Well, we'll have to check that and go fix it if I need to. In this case, whenever you're going to have a FileMaker relationship, it typically needs to be of the same type. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to text. The next thing that I'm going to do is click on storage options. That's because as a constant, I can do one of 2 things. I can choose this option right here to use global storage, or I can choose this do not store calculation results. Now, making it an unstored calculation means that FileMaker is never going to store any data in the index for this database. And some newer FileMaker users come across this situation and they ask, what's the difference between making this a global storage versus a do not store? In this regard, there really is no difference. Whether I choose a global storage or whether I choose a do not store, an unstored constant versus a global constant, calculated constant, are almost exactly the same thing. I have not come across a situation that I know of where they differ. So I'm going to just choose a global storage on this particular one. And let's check that, make sure that I actually put person type. I should have copied that from the database. Let's see over here. I did. Look at that. Perfect. So person type is the value that I want to use. All right, so let's head back into the defined database. And this time we're going to our relationships. So what we have here now is we have created a field that's actually very little cost. This people type field, it's not storing a lot of data. There's nothing that's going to be heavy in terms of our database and the workload that the database has to do. We're basically just saying, FileMaker, we're adding a field to this table, to the values itself, and it's always going to be person type. Strictly for the reason that we can do this. We can now connect the people type, and it's very clear in terms of what we're getting. We're getting from the values table, looking back into the values table itself. So let's throw on a little, we'll use my little highlighter and actually take a look at this when we look at the data. We're saying this constant value, and we can always know that it's a constant or a global by the fact that it's got this little straight little stop sign, I think of it, in terms of its connection. It's a one-way connection. It can't go both ways. It only goes from this way to this way. But it's saying because people type is a constant, you're only going to pull out only those values according to those in the category of person type. And it's really pretty cool. So if you see what we've done here, if you've been working with FileMaker for a long time, then you've probably had this situation where you've got your main graph, and then sprinkled within that graph, you have all kinds of different varying degrees of functionality. First off, you have on the relationship itself, which we haven't even talked about in this beginner series, this option of whether or not records can actually be created, whether they can be deleted, whether they can be sorted. And then aside from that, you're going to have value lists integrated into this, cascading deletes, all kinds of other things. And it becomes very difficult to understand where things are coming from, unless you use good documentation. And we'll have a video about that as well. But in this scenario, what I've done is I have intentionally isolated out my value lists from the rest of the whole of my solution. And it makes it very easy to manage because I don't have to look within this large collection of table occurrences. I just know that all of my value lists that I'm going to generate are typically going to hinge off of this one table occurrence. Now, sometimes I may have others, but again, treat the graph as a way to get what you want, how you want, and sometimes not really when you want. I just wanted to be creative there. All right, so we are going to now create our value list. We're now at the point where we can filter these out. And let's use that little highlighter that I'm talking about as I bring that up. All right, so in our scenario here, let's get that off the screen. There we go. This is in essence what we've done. We have a table occurrence and it's named something. In this case, it's called values because this is the values table. We can see that right there. What's happened is we've taken the opportunity, it's not on the layout. There is a field that we created, which is that constant field, and it's all in caps. And it's I won't take the time to write it, but it's that people type in all caps. And that one field is relating back to the category field within this same field or within this same table. It's called a self relationship. It's a relationship from this table to itself. Should make sense. But because this is a constant value, it's only going to find and match those values that I explicitly want to pull out of those. And that's how we create a related value list. Well, you can create a related value list using any other relationship, but in this case, I wanted just a related value list that just gives me these values alone, customer, vendor, etc. So let's hook it up. All right, turn off that highlighter, zoom out, and do it in our relationship graph. We've got the relationship graph. We're ready for the list itself. So we're going to find that under the File menu. We go to Manage, we go to our value lists, and this is where we modify our value list. We are no longer going to use FileMaker's custom values. And when we double click this and bring this up, we're going to choose this option right here of Use Values from Field. This is the way that we get all of our power with related value lists because it allows us within the user interface to provide users the ability to control, modify, and change all of these different value lists. So the first thing we're going to choose is we are going to choose the point of origin for our value list, or where the values are actually going to come from. So we can choose here, in this scenario, we could probably choose values person type is what we're going to actually choose where we want the values to come from. And we're going to make a selection for the first value that we want to return. Now, the value that you want to return isn't always going to be the value that you want to see. That's why FileMaker has this additional area over here where it says also display values from a second field, but that doesn't become available until we make a selection for the first field. So what do we want to return? Well, in the field, what we want to store is we don't want to store the actual value right here. What we want to store is we want to store the numeration, the 1, 2, or 3, because then we can change the value of the name anytime that we want, and there's no effect to us because we're storing numbers. So now, after making that selection, we can now choose Allow Display Values from a second field. And that's where we choose value. And we do that because we have this option down here that says show values only from the second field. Now, the key takeaway here is that this really only applies to 3 field format types. That is checkboxes, radio buttons, well, 4, checkboxes, radio buttons, and a drop-down list, and it also applies to a pop-up list. But the pop-up list, the problem with that is when you make the selection, a pop-up list actually shows the contents of the field. So what would be shown if I used a pop-up list would be the actual number or the enumeration. Whereas with a drop-down menu, it will still show the actual value, the human readable word. So by checking this right here, show values only from the second field, when I do that, that means that this is going to be shown, customers, vendors, employees, and this is what's going to be stored in the field. Now here's the last option that we need to choose. We need to include only related values starting from, and again, here's a big benefit of separating out all of your value lists into a dedicated group of table occurrences. You're only ever making selections from that. In the world of FileMaker, when you get a massive graph that grows and grows and grows, what ends up happening is just this unlimited scrolling list of all of these things that you can choose from. That becomes a management nightmare. When you isolate out your value lists into this dedicated values table via these self-relationships, it becomes much more manageable, because every value list that you go in to modify when you're using related values, you simply just choose from the values table. Or as long as you use the same prefix, they all just group together. And it's really nice and tight and a handy little bundle. I like that. So what we should have now is our person type value list has now been changed. It was using customer, vendor, employee, custom values, but now this same value list is still assigned onto the field, and we're going to see that. So we click OK, and there it is, customer, employee, vendor. All the values are exactly the same as they were because the values are right here. But here's our advantage. For now on, in the rest of our database, what's stored in the field are the actual numbers. But what's presented to the user, because of the widget of a checkbox or a radio button or a dropdown, is the value that's shown right here. And that is for every record. So let's take a look at that. We're going to go into our invoices. Now remember, when we were using and storing that custom values, FileMaker had data values in here that no longer apply. What's going to be returned is the number. So when I say that this person, Matt Petrowski, is a customer and a vendor, you can see that the values of 1 and 2 get stored. So when I move to my other record of John Smith, he was only an employee, and when I click that, he gets the value of 3. So we've created a little bit of work for us. Now you get to choose when you're going to choose when you're going to use one over the other. To be honest, it really comes down to when you're building the database, are you going to teach users how to use FileMaker the way that FileMaker promotes? And by that, I mean FileMaker promotes that when I go into find mode, I'm going to enter find mode, which I just did with Command or Control F, and I'm going to make a selection here. Now in this scenario, it's really okay, because when I click this field will not be hidden, or it will be hidden. It will not be shown on the layout. So the user doesn't even know that they're actually putting the value of 3 into a particular field. But if I was using a different widget, if I was using a pop-up or just a regular field, there's no way that a user would know that they need to enter the value of 3. But because of the formatting of this field, FileMaker shows the values from the second field, the value, but inputs the value that you select, 3. So when I execute my find, by executing it, what happens is we get our 1 record out of the 2. Only that one person who is John Smith. But from a storage standpoint, this is ideal. This is perfect. This is what we want to have in terms of the storage. The number is really small and it's very trim, but in the user interface, we get the values that we want. And here's the other big benefit. Over here, when we no longer wanted to call these people customers and we wanted to call them something else, there's very little consequence to making that change so quickly and so easily. Because FileMaker, as soon as we move, it updates. We can see there was a little bit of a delay. It just switched it up, and we now have something. But something doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether it's called customer or what have you, because it's all controlled by a related value list. What's stored in the field is obviously still that value of 2. and it just changes on the fly. So that is our ideal for value lists. And my suggestion would be use this structure that I've shown you how to use of this isolated group of table occurrences just dedicated to value lists. And on top of that, you can use one single table, and you now know that you can create a constant value, which we did right here, in order to filter out any sub-value list out of that values table that you want. And you can do it at any time. Just go through that simple related value list dialog box that we just looked at, and you can pull any value list out of all of your value lists within the whole of your FileMaker solution. The rest of what you need to build is basically just a user interface. And that user interface is typically going to come in the form of a portal. You're going to create a dedicated layout where the user can actually move to this. Maybe after this little area right here, you have a little pencil icon, and that means I want to edit this value list. And when you click on that button, it takes you to another layout. It presents all of the different values that the user currently has, and they can go in and they can just add a new value. Now, as a developer, I'm going to be able to just say, well, we've got customers, vendors, employees, and now, I don't know, we'll put in salesmen or salespeople, and we'll add them and we'll give them an enumeration, and that quickly salesman becomes an option that we can now choose from for this value list, and people are added. And that's the power of related value lists. It's also the power of on the graph isolating things out and making it much easier for you to understand your own solution and anybody else who comes in after that fact. So if you have any questions, we're right at the 31-minute mark, and I'm going to be able to take those with regards to these related value lists. I hope as a new FileMaker learner, you've been able to really wrap your head around this, and having this on screen, being able to see what's shown versus what's stored is actually a really helpful thing. You can also see up here, I've started to add a button bar object. Now, it's very easy on this particular view to actually just have these buttons, and you click on customers and then just filter out all customers, because of course we're going to filter out by doing a search for all records where there is a value of 1 in the field of person type, or whatever I call this field. Same with vendors, employees. The rest of how you automate all of this structure is all going to be in our scripting section when we talk about scripting and doing those things. In the rest of these videos, in this part about data structure, we're going to be talking about organizing the graph, learning more about the relationships, creating related records, cascading deletes, all of those different aspects of your FileMaker database. So let's get to those questions. All right, we'll switch over to my video chat and see what we've got here. Just a few of people saying hello. Let's see, Matt, the enumeration aspect is nice, but wouldn't this technique work to clear out the field even if you didn't use a constant? So let me think about that. Nice, but wouldn't this technique work to clear out the field even if you didn't use a constant? Not exactly clear. You might need to give me some more information about when I would, if I did not use a constant in this scenario. I have to be able to get the values out of the combined value list or the values table. I think that question may be in context to potentially creating multiple different values tables for smaller sub-value lists, when what I'm promoting is actually using one single values table for all value lists. And if you're going to filter that data out, then you have to be able to filter it out based on some type of classified data. And so that's what I'm doing right here, where you can see that the only thing out of all of this, when I get the person type value list, which is related based on the category, is only pulling out those values of this one, this one, this one, and this one, but it's ignoring this one, and this one. But yet I'm able to store all my value lists in one table. So let's see if a comment, a follow-up comment came back in that. There we go. We got something. Clear out equal getting rid of the original employee. No, it does not clear out the values. If I have, remember, in our fields, in a value list a field that's based on a checkbox. Oops, I need to switch. Sorry about that. remember, FileMaker will secretly keep all previous values. I can still have, and you can even use this for a trick, I can still have other stuff in here. And FileMaker ignores anything with regards to the value list. You can see I can uncheck all of these, and other stuff is still going to stay in that field. But yet, if this field was not on the layout, users wouldn't even know that anything is in there. So you can sort of use this in some cases as you can use it for the purpose of techniques. It's super tricky to do, where you basically add a ride-along value. But you can see that as I make selections, FileMaker doesn't even bother to make any modifications there. Let me show my additional values here as I get this a little bit wider, and we go into browse mode. Don't save that, and yeah, so you can see that FileMaker doesn't care. If I present a widget or a field, if you will, it's only going to take into account what the options are assigned to that value list while it still stays. All right, so hopefully that clears that one up. And we'll switch over to Chrome for me. All right. Thanks, Matt. No questions today. Do you have some kind of order for future videos? You know, Eric, actually, I am just sort of, I'm going ad hoc and showing things as I feel like people should be exposed to them. I don't have a planned agenda. It's just a super general agenda of when we hit things. And so I sort of just think it up. But if there's stuff that you would like me to cover, I'm happy to do freeform days and other things of that nature. Put your comments down below on this video. Say, you know, can you cover this or can you cover that? I'm pretty much just dedicating an hour each day in order to actually shoot these videos and talk about learning FileMaker as if I knew nothing. And so tell me what you want to learn. Tell me your problems and let's address them. There's so many different ways to approach it. It's you know, it's cool. It's up to you. All right, without any questions, I think that's going to give us a wrap on this video. So we're going to do our head out here. And if you'd like to be notified via YouTube, you can click the subscribe. That's going to come up there. The next video in this series, when I shoot it, is going to come up right there. And as always, check out my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. I've got more techniques, weekly videos, and stuff you can really take advantage of. All right, see you later.